In the unforgiving mountains of Afghanistan, where every shadow could hide death and every sound might be your last, there existed a legend that even hardened Navy SEALs whispered about in hushed tones. They called her Deadeye, a ghost who could drop a target from impossible distances, vanish without a trace, and reappear where you least expected. But legends, as Colonel Marcus Hammer Rodriguez was about to discover, sometimes walked among mortals wearing the face of an ordinary woman. When Sarah Chen stepped into that remote forward operating base, cleaning her custom M24 sniper rifle with the casual precision of someone folding laundry, she had no idea that her carefully constructed world was about to collide with the one person who could unravel 15 years of secrets. The weapon in her hands told a story that could start wars or end them, and Colonel Rodriguez, with his decades of Black Ops experience, recognized the craftsmanship immediately. "Where did you get that weapon?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a distant firefight, heavy with implications that neither of them fully understood yet. Sarah's hands never paused in their methodical cleaning, but something shifted in her eyes, a flicker of recognition, perhaps, or the first crack in an armor she'd spent years perfecting. What followed would challenge everything they thought they knew about loyalty, sacrifice, and the thin line between hero and ghost. In a world where the deadliest weapons aren't always made of steel and gunpowder, sometimes the most dangerous thing you can possess is the truth. This is the story of how a single question changed the course of two lives forever, set against the backdrop of humanity's most unforgiving theater of war. The morning mist clung to the Hindu Kush mountains like a shroud, and forward operating base Vanguard buzzed with the controlled chaos that had become second nature to the men and women stationed there. Colonel Marcus Rodriguez stepped out of the Tactical Operations Center, his weathered face scanning the compound with eyes that missed nothing. 23 years in the Navy SEALs had taught him to read the subtle languages of war, the way shadows fell differently when someone was watching, how silence could scream danger louder than gunfire. He was heading toward the communications bunker when he saw her. A woman sat alone on a makeshift bench outside the armory, her back straight as a rifle barrel, working on something in her lap with the focused intensity of a surgeon. The early morning light caught the auburn highlights in her brown hair, which was pulled back in a regulation ponytail that somehow managed to look both military precise and effortlessly elegant. She wore standard desert camouflage, nothing that would make her stand out among the 200 souls who called this remote outpost home. But it was what she was cleaning that made Marcus stop dead in his tracks. The rifle was a thing of beauty and deadly precision. At first glance, it appeared to be a standard M24 sniper weapon system, the kind that had been faithfully serving American forces for decades. But Marcus had spent enough time around specialized weapons to know custom work when he saw it. The stock had been modified with what looked like carbon fiber reinforcement. The barrel, while maintaining the classic M24 profile, or subtle machining marks that suggested handfitting by someone who understood ballistics on an almost molecular level. Most telling of all was the scope. Marcus could see from 30 feet away that it wasn't military issue. The glass was too clear, the mounting system too sophisticated, the whole assembly radiating the kind of precision that cost more than most soldiers made in a year. The woman's hands moved with practiced efficiency as she disassembled the bolt, each movement economic and sure. She held each component up to the light, examining it with the critical eye of someone whose life depended on mechanical perfection. When she began cleaning the barrel with a bore snake, her technique was flawless, not the hurried maintenance of a weekend warrior, but the methodical ritual of someone who had performed this action thousands of times. Marcus found himself walking toward her before he made a conscious decision to do so. Something about the scene nagged at him, a feeling he'd learned to trust during his years in the teams. His approach was casual, the kind of wandering that characterized off-duty movement around the base, but his eyes never left her hands. "Morning," he said when he was close enough for conversation. She looked up, and Marcus felt something shift in his understanding of the situation. Her eyes were green with flecks of gold, and they held a depth that spoke of experiences beyond her apparent age. She couldn't have been more than 35, but those eyes belonged to someone who had seen enough for several lifetimes. "Good morning, Colonel," she replied, her voice carrying a slight accent he couldn't quite place. Not foreign, exactly, but not quite American either. The kind of vocal coloring that came from spending time in too many places, speaking too many languages. "Beautiful day for maintenance, isn't it?" Her smile was warm and genuine, but it didn't quite reach those eyes. Marcus had met operators who could smile while planning your death, and something in this woman's demeanor triggered the same warning signals. "That's quite a rifle," he said, nodding toward the weapon. "Don't see many M24s with that kind of customization." Her hands paused for just a fraction of a second before resuming their work. To most people, the hesitation would have been invisible. To someone trained to read micro-expressions in life or death situations, it might as well have been a flashing neon sign. Family heirloom, she said, her tone light and conversational. My grandfather was quite the marksman. Had some work done on it over the years. Marcus nodded, but every instinct was screaming that the explanation was rehearsed. He'd heard enough cover stories to recognize the careful balance between detail and vagueness that characterized a well-prepared lie. What unit are you with? He asked, settling onto the bench beside her with the easy familiarity of someone accustomed to making conversation with strangers in strange places. Independent contractor, she replied, which was true enough to pass casual scrutiny but vague enough to discourage follow-up questions. Consulting on some technical matters for the intelligence division. Marcus knew most of the contractors who rotated through Vanguard. The base wasn't large enough for strangers to remain anonymous for long, and he made it his business to know who was sharing his operational space. Yet he had no memory of this woman arriving, no briefing about her presence, no paperwork crossing his desk with her clearance levels. I'm Marcus Rodriguez, he said, extending his hand. Base Commander. Sarah Chen, she replied, accepting the handshake with a grip that was firm without being aggressive. Pleased to meet you, Colonel. Her hand was calloused in specific places, thumb and trigger finger worn smooth by years of handling firearms, palm marked by the distinctive pattern of someone who had spent considerable time with climbing ropes. These weren't the soft hands of a rear-echelon consultant. Chen, Marcus mused aloud. That's Chinese? Among other things, Sarah said with another of those careful smiles. My family tree is a bit complicated. She reassembled the rifle with movements so fluid they seemed choreographed. Each piece found its place without hesitation, the entire process taking less than 3 minutes. When she was finished, she performed a function check with the casual competence of someone who could probably field strip and reassemble the weapon blindfolded. Marcus watched the entire process with growing fascination. The woman's technique was flawless, but, more than that, it was personal. She handled the rifle the way a musician might handle a cherished instrument, with a familiarity that spoke of countless hours of practice and an intimate understanding of every component. Where did you get that weapon? The question slipped out before Marcus could stop himself, carrying more intensity than he'd intended. Sarah's hands stilled completely this time, and, when she looked at him, the careful mask of casual friendliness had shifted. Not fallen away entirely, but adjusted enough for Marcus to see the steel beneath. That's an interesting question, Colonel, she said, her voice still pleasant but carrying an undertone he couldn't quite identify. Might I ask why it matters to you? Marcus found himself in the uncomfortable position of not having a good answer. Military protocol demanded that he know about any weapons on his base, but his interest went beyond standard security concerns. Something about this rifle, about this woman, was setting off alarm bells that had nothing to do with regulations and everything to do with instinct. Professional curiosity, he said finally. I've spent a lot of time around specialized weapons. Your rifle has some modifications I've never seen before. Sarah nodded slowly, as if weighing his response against some internal criteria. When she spoke again, her voice carried a note of what might have been respect. The stock modifications are for recoil management, she said, running her hand along the rifle's length with obvious affection. Carbon fiber reinforcement allows for weight reduction without sacrificing stability. The trigger has been adjusted to a precise 2-pound pull with zero creep. The barrel is free-floated and has been hand-lapped for optimal accuracy. Each technical detail was delivered with the confidence of someone who understood the engineering behind the modifications. This wasn't memorized information, it was practical knowledge gained through experience. And the scope? Marcus asked. Sarah's smile gained a hint of genuine warmth for the first time since their conversation began. Now that's where it gets interesting, she said. Custom ground glass with specialized coatings for enhanced light transmission. The reticle is calibrated for specific ammunition loads, and the turrets have been modified for precise adjustments in extreme conditions. Sounds like it could reach out and touch someone at considerable distance, Marcus observed. In the right hands, Sarah agreed, her tone carefully neutral. Marcus felt like he was dancing around the edges of something significant, but every attempt to probe deeper seemed to bounce off the woman's carefully constructed responses. She was giving him technical information freely enough, but nothing that would reveal who she really was or why she was here. Have you had a chance to test it since arriving? He asked, trying a different approach. Not yet, Sarah replied. I was hoping to find a suitable range. The technical specifications look adequate, but you never really know until you put rounds down range. Marcus knew she was referring to the sniper range that had been constructed in a natural depression about 2 miles from the main base. It was designed to accommodate shots out to 1,500 meters, with steel targets at various distances to test both equipment and skill. I could arrange range time, he offered. We've got a facility that should meet your requirements. Sarah's eyes sharpened with what looked like genuine interest. That would be very helpful, Colonel. When might that be possible? Tomorrow morning, Marcus said, making the decision on the spot. 0600, before the heat gets too bad. I might even join you, if you don't mind the company. I'd welcome it, Sarah said, and this time her smile seemed completely genuine. It's always interesting to shoot with someone who appreciates good equipment. As Marcus stood to leave, he realized he'd learned virtually nothing concrete about Sarah Chen or her mysterious rifle. Every question had been answered, but none of the answers had provided real information. She was either exactly what she claimed to be, an independent contractor with an expensive hobby, or she was one of the most skilled operators he'd ever encountered. His instincts, honed by years of combat and command, were screaming that Sarah Chen was far more than she appeared. The question was whether that made her an asset or a threat. Walking back toward the Tactical Operations Center, Marcus made a mental note to have his intelligence officer run a background check on their mysterious consultant. Something told him that Sarah Chen's story had layers he hadn't even begun to discover, and, in a place like Afghanistan, unknown variables had a way of becoming deadly complications. Behind him, Sarah watched the colonel's retreating figure with eyes that revealed none of her own thoughts. She had expected this conversation eventually. Men like Rodriguez didn't survive in special operations by ignoring their instincts. The question now was how much investigation her presence would trigger and whether her carefully constructed cover would hold under serious scrutiny. She looked down at the rifle in her hands, a weapon that carried secrets dating back 15 years and 3 different conflicts. Tomorrow's range session would be more than just a test of marksmanship. It would be the first real challenge to the new identity she'd spent 2 years building. For now, though, she allowed herself to enjoy the mountain morning and the familiar weight of perfectly maintained steel and wood in her hands. Whatever tomorrow brought, she would face it the same way she'd faced every challenge for the past decade and a half, with precision, preparation, and the absolute confidence that came from being very, very good at staying alive. The morning air was crisp and thin at 8,000 feet above sea level, carrying the scent of snow from the distant peaks and the ever-present dust that seemed to permeate everything in Afghanistan. Marcus arrived at the sniper range 30 minutes before the scheduled time, a habit ingrained by decades of military service. What surprised him was finding Sarah Chen already there, lying prone behind the firing line with her rifle assembled and ready. She wore the same desert camouflage as the day before, but now Marcus could see details he'd missed during their first encounter. Her boots were civilian hiking models, expensive and well-maintained, with wear patterns that suggested extensive use in mountainous terrain. Her gear was minimal but carefully chosen, a small pack that looked like it contained exactly what she needed and nothing more, a spotting scope that probably cost more than most soldiers' monthly pay, and a shooting mat that showed signs of use in multiple climates. "You're early," Marcus said as he approached, carrying his own rifle case and a thermos of coffee that steamed in the cool air. "Old habits," Sarah replied without taking her eye from the spotting scope. "I like to study the range conditions before committing to any serious shooting." Marcus set down his equipment and pulled out his own rifle, a custom-built precision weapon based on the Remington 700 action that had served him well in numerous deployments. It was a fine rifle, accurate and reliable, but, next to Sarah's modified M24, it looked almost mundane. "What are you seeing out there?" he asked, settling beside her and adjusting his own spotting scope. "Interesting conditions," Sarah said, her voice carrying the focused calm of someone in their element. "Wind is variable, probably due to the valley thermals starting to build as the sun hits the eastern slopes. Right now it's holding steady at about 5 miles per hour from the northwest, but I can see grass movement at the 600-meter mark that suggests a crosswind component." Marcus studied the distant targets through his scope, noting the subtle environmental indicators Sarah had identified. Her wind reading was accurate, impressive given that most shooters would need several minutes to make the same assessment. "Temperatures rising faster than I'd expect for this elevation," she continued. "Probably looking at some interesting mirage effects once the sun gets higher. Should make for challenging shooting conditions in about an hour." "Sounds like you've done this before," Marcus observed. Sarah's laugh was soft and genuine. "Once or twice.
Though I have to say, this is some of the most beautiful country I've ever shot in.
Deadly, but beautiful.
She was right about that.
The range had been positioned to take advantage of a natural bowl in the mountains, with steel targets placed at distances from 300 to 1500 meters. The backdrop was a towering cliff face that would safely stop even the heaviest rounds, while the surrounding peaks provided a view that could distract even the most focused marksman.
Mind if I ask what brings an independent contractor to our little corner of paradise?
Marcus asked as he began setting up his rifle. Sarah considered the question for a moment, her hands automatically adjusting her rifle's position while she thought.
Pattern analysis, she said finally. There's been some unusual activity in this sector that doesn't fit standard insurgent behavior. My job is to figure out what's different and why.
It was the kind of vague answer that could mean anything or nothing, but Marcus sensed truth beneath the deliberate ambiguity. Pattern analysis was exactly the sort of work that would bring civilian contractors to forward operating bases, and unusual activity was certainly something that commanded attention at his level.
What kind of patterns? He pressed gently.
Movement profiles that don't match known Taliban or Al-Qaeda methodologies, Sarah said, adjusting her scope's focus.
Operational signatures that suggest either a new player or a significant evolution in existing groups' capabilities. Marcus nodded, understanding the implications. In counterinsurgency warfare, changes in enemy behavior patterns often preceded major operational shifts.
If someone was paying attention to those changes, it suggested either very good intelligence work or very specialized experience.
Are you finding what you're looking for? He asked.
Still gathering data, Sarah replied diplomatically.
But, yes, there are definitely some interesting developments in this area of operations.
She settled behind her rifle with movements that spoke of countless hours of practice. Her position was textbook perfect, body aligned behind the scope, left hand supporting the rifle's stock with just enough pressure to maintain control without inducing tension, right hand gripping the pistol grip with relaxed authority.
What's your first target?
Marcus asked, noting that she'd already dialed in an elevation adjustment on her scope. 600 meters steel, Sarah said without hesitation.
Good distance to check zero without dealing with too many environmental factors.
Marcus watched through his spotting scope as Sarah settled into her shot. Her breathing pattern was controlled and rhythmic, the kind of respiratory discipline that took years to develop. When she finally broke the trigger, the rifle's report echoed off the surrounding cliffs like thunder. The impact was immediate and unmistakable, a bright flash as the bullet struck the steel target dead center, followed by the distinctive ring of metal on metal that reached them a second later.
Nice shot, Marcus said, though the word nice seemed inadequate.
The hit had been perfect, placed in the exact center of the 8-inch steel plate with no deviation.
Let me try the 800,
Sarah said, already making scope adjustments with the fluid competence of someone who understood ballistics intuitively.
Her second shot was as precise as the first, striking the more distant target with the same mechanical accuracy.
Marcus began to realize he wasn't watching someone test their equipment, he was watching someone demonstrate capabilities that bordered on the supernatural.
Your turn, Sarah said, moving aside to give Marcus room at the firing line.
Marcus took his position and aimed at the 600-meter target. His shot was good, well within the acceptable accuracy standards for military snipers, but noticeably off-center compared to Sarah's pinpoint placement.
Solid hit, Sarah commented, though Marcus could hear the professional assessment in her voice.
She was being polite, but they both knew his shooting, while competent, wasn't in the same league as hers.
How about we try something more challenging? Sarah suggested. The 1200-meter target?
Marcus had hit targets at that distance before, but it required considerable skill and optimal conditions. At 1200 meters, factors like wind, temperature, and ammunition consistency became critical variables that could easily send a shot wide. Sarah resumed her position and began the careful process of calculating her shot. She consulted a small notebook filled with handwritten data tables, made several scope adjustments, and spent almost 5 minutes studying the wind indicators between her position and the distant target. When she fired, Marcus was watching through his spotting scope with intense concentration. The bullet's flight time at that distance was long enough to build suspense, nearly 2 seconds between the rifle's crack and the target's response. The hit was perfect. Not just on target, but centered with the kind of precision that professional snipers spend careers trying to achieve. Marcus lowered his spotting scope and looked at Sarah with new understanding. That's exceptional shooting, he said, and this time there was no diplomatic politeness in his assessment. I've seen some of the best marksmen in the world, and very few could make that shot under these conditions." Sarah smiled, but Marcus noticed she didn't seem surprised by the compliment. "Good equipment makes a significant difference," she said modestly.
"Equipment doesn't pull the trigger," Marcus replied.
"That level of accuracy takes years to develop."
"I've had good teachers," Sarah said, which was true enough without revealing anything specific. Marcus decided to push a little harder. "Military training?"
"Among other things," Sarah replied, giving him that carefully neutral smile again. They continued shooting for another hour, and, with each shot, Marcus became more convinced that Sarah Chen was operating under a carefully constructed cover identity. Her marksmanship was at the level of elite military snipers, her equipment knowledge was encyclopedic, and her tactical awareness was constantly active. She noticed changes in wind direction before they showed up on the range flags, spotted movement in the surrounding hills that turned out to be mountain goats, and demonstrated the kind of environmental awareness that kept people alive in hostile territory. But it was during their conversation breaks that Marcus gathered the most interesting intelligence.
Sarah's knowledge of regional geography was remarkably detailed for a civilian contractor.
She made casual references to terrain features and village locations that wouldn't appear on standard maps, and her understanding of local tribal dynamics was sophisticated enough to suggest extensive experience in the area.
"You seem to know this region well," Marcus observed during one of their breaks.
"I've spent some time here over the years," Sarah acknowledged. "It's important to understand the operational environment when you're doing pattern analysis."
"How much time?" Marcus asked. Sarah paused, as if calculating how much truth she could safely reveal. "This will be my 4th deployment to Afghanistan," she said finally. "Spread out over about 8 years.
For deployments over 8 years suggested someone with either a very specialized skill set or a very specific mission focus.
Civilian contractors typically didn't maintain that kind of regional consistency unless they were providing irreplaceable expertise. "What brought you back so many times?" Marcus asked. "Continuity," Sarah said simply. "These kinds of analytical projects require long-term observation.
Changes in insurgent behavior patterns don't happen overnight, and understanding them requires sustained attention." It was a reasonable explanation, but Marcus noticed she didn't mention who was paying for 8 years of specialized analysis or why pattern recognition required someone with her level of operational skills. As the morning progressed and the sun climbed higher, the shooting conditions became more challenging exactly as Sarah had predicted. Heat mirages began dancing off the distant rocks, and the wind patterns shifted from steady to variable. Most shooters would have called it quits, but Sarah adapted to each change with the unconscious competence of someone who had faced similar challenges countless times. Her final shot of the session was at the maximum range, 1,500 meters, with challenging wind conditions and significant heat distortion. She spent almost 10 minutes calculating the shot, consulting multiple references and making careful observations of environmental conditions. When she fired, Marcus held his breath during the bullet's 3-second flight time. The impact was slightly off-center, maybe 2 inches from perfect, but still well within the lethal zone of the target.
"Outstanding," Marcus said, meaning it completely.
Sarah nodded with satisfaction as she began breaking down her rifle for cleaning. "Not bad for a morning's work," she agreed. As they packed up their equipment, Marcus made his decision.
Sarah Chen, whoever she really was, represented either a valuable asset or a significant security concern. Either way, he needed to know more. "Would you be interested in joining me for dinner tonight?" he asked.
"There's a decent mess hall, and I'd enjoy continuing our conversation." Sarah studied his face for a moment, as if reading the motivations behind the invitation. "I'd like that," she said finally. "It's not often I get to discuss marksmanship with someone who appreciates the finer points." Walking back toward the main base, Marcus reflected on what he'd learned and what remained mysterious about Sarah Chen. Her shooting skills placed her in the top 1% of marksmen he'd encountered. Her tactical knowledge was extensive and current. Her equipment was expensive and perfectly maintained. And her story, while plausible, had gaps large enough to hide significant secrets. Tonight's dinner would be more than social courtesy. It would be Marcus's chance to probe deeper into the mystery of the woman who shot like a legend and smiled like someone with nothing to hide. Behind him, Sarah cleaned her rifle with the same methodical precision she'd demonstrated that morning. She'd enjoyed the shooting session more than she'd expected, and Colonel Rodriguez's company had been genuinely pleasant. But she knew his dinner invitation was motivated by more than social interest, and tomorrow would bring new challenges to her carefully maintained cover story. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the compound as both of them prepared for an evening conversation that would test the boundaries of truth and deception in ways neither of them fully anticipated. The mess hall at Forward Operating Base Vanguard was a study in functional military efficiency: long tables, practical chairs, and fluorescent lighting that cast everything in stark relief. But tonight, Marcus had arranged for something more private. A small conference room adjacent to the main dining area had been set up with a table for two, complete with real plates instead of the usual metal trays and what passed for decent wine in a combat zone. Sarah arrived precisely on time, wearing clean fatigues and carrying herself with the same casual confidence Marcus had noticed during their first encounter. She'd left her rifle secured in the armory, but Marcus noted she still wore a sidearm, a compact pistol and a tactical holster that suggested she was authorized to carry weapons throughout the base. "This is quite civilized," Sarah said, accepting the chair Marcus held for her. "Not what I expected from a forward operating base." "We have our moments," Marcus replied, settling across from her. "Sometimes it's worth remembering why we're fighting for civilization by actually practicing a little of it." The meal was simple but well-prepared: grilled chicken, rice, vegetables that had somehow retained their color despite the supply chain challenges of mountain warfare. They ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes, both of them using the time to study each other with the subtle intensity of professionals sizing up potential allies or threats. "Tell me about your background," Marcus said finally, setting down his fork and leaning back in his chair. 8 years in Afghanistan is a long time for civilian work." Sarah smiled, the expression warm but guarded. "Not much to tell, really. I started as a graduate student studying regional conflict patterns for my doctorate. The work caught the attention of some people in the intelligence community, and one thing led to another." "What was your doctoral focus?" Marcus asked. "Anthropological analysis of insurgent recruitment patterns in tribal societies," Sarah replied without hesitation. "Specifically how traditional kinship structures influence modern asymmetric warfare tactics." It was a sophisticated answer, delivered with the confidence of someone who actually understood the subject matter. Marcus made a mental note to have his intelligence officer verify whether such a dissertation existed and who might have written it. "That's quite specialized," he observed. "Most civilian contractors I encounter have more practical backgrounds: former military, retired law enforcement, that sort of thing." "Academic backgrounds can be just as valuable," Sarah said diplomatically. "Understanding the cultural context of conflict is essential for effective pattern analysis." Marcus nodded, filing away the careful way she deflected his implied question about military service. "And the marksmanship skills?" "That's not typical graduate school curriculum." Sarah's laugh was genuinely amused. "My grandfather, actually. He was a sniper in World War II Pacific Theater. Spent my childhood summers learning to shoot at his ranch in Montana. By the time I was 16, I could outshoot most of the local hunting guides." The story had the ring of partial truth, enough specific detail to be credible, but conveniently explaining exceptional skills without revealing professional training. Marcus had heard similar biographical constructions from deep cover operatives, carefully crafted to withstand casual scrutiny while concealing operational backgrounds. "Must have been quite a grandfather," Marcus said. "World War II snipers were a special breed." "He was," Sarah agreed, and, for the first time, Marcus heard something in her voice that sounded completely genuine. "He taught me that precision wasn't just about hitting targets. It was about understanding yourself, your equipment, and your environment well enough that success became inevitable rather than lucky." "Sound philosophy," Marcus said. "Applicable beyond marksmanship." "Absolutely. The principles of precision, patience, preparation, practice, they work for almost anything worth doing well." They continued eating while Marcus considered his next approach. Sarah's answers were consistently plausible, but each one raised new questions. Her academic credentials would be easy enough to verify, but the timeline troubled him. 8 years in Afghanistan, starting as a graduate student, suggested either remarkable career acceleration or a cover story designed to explain extended presence in the region. "What kind of unusual patterns have you been tracking?" Marcus asked, shifting to her professional work. "You mentioned earlier that something in this sector doesn't fit standard insurgent profiles." Sarah set down her water glass and leaned forward slightly, her expression becoming more focused.
over the past 18 months, there's been a series of incidents that don't match known Taliban or Al-Qaeda operational signatures.
Precision strikes against high-value targets, sophisticated intelligence gathering, coordination that suggests professional military training.
Marcus felt his attention sharpen.
What she was describing sounded like the work of elite special operations units, not insurgent groups.
What kind of precision strikes?
Eliminations of specific individuals at extreme range, often in circumstances that suggest extensive surveillance and planning. The target selection is interesting too, not just coalition forces, but also Afghan government officials and even some Taliban leadership that opposed certain factions.
Someone's cleaning house, Marcus said grimly. That's one interpretation, Sarah agreed. But the targeting pattern suggests something more complex.
It's as if someone with access to high-level intelligence is systematically eliminating people who pose specific threats to a particular agenda.
Marcus considered the implications.
If Sarah's analysis was correct, they were dealing with a sophisticated operation that went beyond typical insurgent activity. The kind of precision she was describing required resources, training, and intelligence capabilities that suggested either foreign special operations or a very well-funded private operation.
How long range are we talking about? Marcus asked. Sarah hesitated for just a moment before answering.
Confirmed kills at distances exceeding 1,200 meters. In at least 3 cases, the estimated range was over 1,500 meters.
Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air.
Those were the distances that required exceptional skill, specialized equipment, and intimate knowledge of ballistics and environmental conditions. The kind of shooting he'd watched Sarah demonstrate that morning.
That's expert-level marksmanship, he said carefully.
Yes, it is, Sarah agreed, meeting his eyes directly. Which is why the pattern is so concerning.
There aren't many people with those capabilities in this region.
The conversation had taken on a new dimension. Marcus realized that Sarah wasn't just analyzing patterns, she was hunting someone whose skills matched her own. The question was whether she was hunting as law enforcement or as competition.
Do you have any theories about who might be responsible? Marcus asked.
Sarah was quiet for a long moment, as if weighing how much she could safely reveal. There are several possibilities, she said finally. Foreign special operations conducting black missions, private military contractors working for undisclosed clients, or
what?
Marcus prompted when she didn't finish. Or someone who's gone completely off the reservation, Sarah said softly. Someone with the skills and equipment to operate independently, pursuing their own agenda.
The implications hung in the air between them.
A rogue sniper with professional-level capabilities could wreak havoc in a region like Afghanistan, where coalition forces operated in small units across vast, difficult terrain.
What evidence suggests it might be a rogue operator? Marcus asked. The target selection doesn't serve any coherent strategic purpose, Sarah explained.
If this were a foreign military operation, the targets would align with national interests. If it were insurgent activity, the pattern would reflect tribal or religious motivations. But these eliminations seem personal, as if someone is settling individual scores rather than pursuing operational objectives. Marcus found himself studying Sarah's face as she spoke, looking for any tell that might reveal her true relationship to the investigation. Her analysis was sophisticated and detailed, suggesting either exceptional intelligence work or intimate familiarity with the subject. "How close are you to identifying this person?" he asked. "Closer than I was 6 months ago," Sarah said with what might have been satisfaction. "The operational patterns are becoming clearer, and there are only so many people with the necessary capabilities in this region."
"And when you identify them?" Sarah's expression hardened almost imperceptibly.
"That depends on what we discover about their motivations and allegiances.
Justice takes different forms in a combat zone."
The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the conference room door. Marcus's communications sergeant entered with an apologetic expression. "Sorry to interrupt, sir, but we've got an urgent message from Sector Command. They need you in the Tactical Operations Center immediately." Marcus stood, his mind already shifting to whatever crisis required his attention. "I'm sorry," he said to Sarah.
"Duty calls. Perhaps we can continue this conversation tomorrow?" "Of course," Sarah replied, also rising. "Thank you for dinner, Colonel. And for the stimulating discussion." As Marcus headed toward the door, Sarah's voice stopped him. Colonel? The patterns we discussed tonight, they're accelerating.
Whatever's happening in this sector, I believe it's building towards something significant. Marcus turned back to face her, noting the serious intensity in her expression.
How significant?
The kind that changes the operational environment permanently, Sarah said quietly.
I'd recommend increased security protocols for high-value personnel in the coming weeks.
With that warning hanging in the air, Marcus left for the Tactical Operations Center, his mind churning with new questions about Sarah Chan and her mysterious investigation. Behind him, Sarah began clearing the dinner table with the same methodical precision she brought to everything else, but her eyes held a distant focus that suggested her thoughts were already miles away, tracking patterns only she could see. The night air outside was crisp and clear, filled with the distant sounds of a military base that never truly slept. Somewhere in the surrounding mountains, Marcus knew, deadly games were being played by people with skills most soldiers could barely comprehend. The question that kept him awake as he dealt with the evening's crisis was whether Sarah Chen was hunting the monster in the darkness, or whether she was the monster herself, hiding in plain sight. Either way, Marcus realized, tomorrow would bring new complications to an already dangerous situation. In counterinsurgency warfare, the line between ally and enemy was often razor-thin, and mistaking one for the other could be fatal. As the base settled into its nighttime routine, Sarah stood at the window of her temporary quarters, studying the mountain silhouettes against the star-filled sky. 15 years of careful planning were approaching their conclusion, and Colonel Rodriguez's suspicions, while understandable, could not be allowed to interfere with objectives that had been set in motion long before either of them arrived at forward operating base Vanguard. The rifle she'd cleaned so carefully that morning lay disassembled in its case, each component holding memories of targets eliminated and missions completed across 3 different conflicts. Tomorrow would test not just her marksmanship, but her ability to maintain the delicate balance between revelation and concealment that had kept her alive and operational for more than a decade. In the distance, a night patrol's radio chatter crackled through the thin air, the voices of young soldiers who had no idea they were living at the intersection of multiple deadly agendas. Sarah closed the window and began her own preparations for tomorrow's challenges, knowing that in the complex chess game of modern warfare, the most dangerous opponents were often the ones who smiled and shared dinner while calculating the precise angle for a killing shot. The emergency in the Tactical Operations Center kept Marcus awake until nearly 0300 hours, dealing with intelligence reports of increased insurgent activity in the surrounding valleys. By the time he finally made it to his quarters, his mind was buzzing with operational concerns that went far beyond the normal challenges of running a forward operating base.
Sarah Chen's warnings about accelerating patterns seemed prophetic in light of the night's developments. 3 different patrols had reported possible sniper activity in sectors that had been quiet for weeks. No shots fired, no casualties, but the unmistakable feeling of being watched by hostile eyes. Professional soldiers developed instincts about such things, and, when multiple teams reported similar sensations, it suggested someone with serious skills was operating in the area. Marcus managed 3 hours of fitful sleep before his alarm brought him back to consciousness.
Outside his window, the eastern sky was beginning to lighten with the promise of another clear mountain morning. He dressed quickly and headed for the communications bunker to check overnight reports, but his path took him past the armory where he'd first encountered Sarah Chen. She was there again, sitting on the same bench in the pre-dawn darkness, working on her rifle with a small tactical flashlight clenched between her teeth. The scene was so similar to their first meeting that Marcus wondered if she made a habit of early morning maintenance, or if something specific had prompted this particular session.
Couldn't sleep either? Marcus asked as he approached.
Sarah looked up, the flashlight's beam briefly illuminating her face before she removed it from her mouth. Old habits, she said, echoing her words from the previous morning.
I always check my equipment when the operational environment changes. Changes how?
Marcus asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. Your patrols had an interesting night, Sarah said, returning her attention to the rifle's bolt assembly.
3 separate reports of possible sniper activity. That's not coincidental.
Marcus felt his suspicions crystallize into something approaching certainty.
Sarah's knowledge of patrol reports suggested access to intelligence that went beyond her supposed role as an independent contractor.
Either she had sources inside his command structure, or she was the source of the activity that had his teams on edge.
How do you know about patrol reports? He asked directly.
Sarah's hands paused in their work, and, when she looked at him, her expression had shifted. The careful mask of casual competence was still in place, but now Marcus could see calculation behind it. I maintain liaison with your intelligence division, she said carefully. part of my pattern analysis requires access to current operational intelligence. It was a plausible explanation, but Marcus knew his own briefing procedures.
Civilian contractors, regardless of their clearance levels, didn't receive real-time patrol reports unless they were directly involved in mission planning. Sarah's knowledge suggested either unofficial information sharing or a much more significant role than she'd admitted. "Which member of my intelligence division?" Marcus asked.
Sarah smiled, but this time it didn't reach her eyes at all. "I think you know that's not how these arrangements work, Colonel. Operational security applies to information sources as well as targets." Marcus found himself in the uncomfortable position of recognizing professional tradecraft. Sarah's deflection was textbook intelligence work: acknowledge the question without providing actionable information, redirect attention to procedural justifications, maintain plausible cover while revealing nothing substantial. "We need to talk," Marcus said quietly.
"Officially."
"I understand your position," Sarah replied, reassembling her rifle with fluid efficiency.
"But I believe you'll find that my authorizations are quite comprehensive. A phone call to your chain of command would clarify any questions about my status."
The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Sarah was suggesting that inquiries about her presence would be discouraged at levels above Marcus's command authority. In the world of black operations and special access programs, such arrangements were not uncommon, but they invariably meant that the person in question was involved in activities far removed from their official cover story.
"What are you really doing here?" Marcus asked bluntly.
Sarah stood, slinging her rifle across her shoulder with practiced ease.
"Exactly what I told you, Colonel. Pattern analysis. The fact that those patterns are becoming active rather than historical doesn't change my mission parameters."
She began walking toward the main base, and Marcus fell into step beside her. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of cooking fires from the distant village and the ever-present dust that characterized life in the Afghan mountains. It should have been a peaceful moment, but Marcus felt the tension of unresolved questions crackling between them.
"The sniper activity last night," Marcus said. "Is that part of the pattern you're tracking?" "It's consistent with the escalation I mentioned," Sarah acknowledged. "Someone is moving from preparation to active operations." "Someone who shoots like you do?"
Sarah stopped walking and turned to face him directly. For a moment, Marcus thought she was going to drop her cover entirely and explain what was really happening.
Instead, she gave him a smile that was both sad and resolute.
"Colonel, in my experience, the most dangerous assumptions are the ones that seem most obvious.
If your instincts are telling you something doesn't add up, you should trust them.
But you should also be very careful about acting on incomplete information in a situation like this."
The warning was clear enough.
Marcus was getting close to something that could be dangerous for everyone involved, including himself. But rather than backing away from the mystery, he found his determination increasing. Whatever Sarah Chen was really doing at Forward Operating Base Vanguard, it was significant enough to warrant high-level protection and dangerous enough to threaten his people. "I'm responsible for the safety of everyone on this base," Marcus said firmly.
"That includes understanding any threats that might be operating in the area." "I understand completely," Sarah replied.
"But some threats can only be neutralized by people with very specific capabilities. Sometimes the best thing regular forces can do is stay clear of the operational area until the specialized work is finished." They had reached the communications bunker, and Marcus knew he had a choice to make. He could push harder, demand answers, and risk whatever consequences came with challenging someone who clearly had powerful protections. Or he could trust that Sarah's presence, whatever its true nature, was aligned with legitimate objectives. His decision was interrupted by his communications sergeant emerging from the bunker with an urgent expression. "Colonel, we've got a priority message from Division.
They want to speak with you immediately."
Marcus glanced at Sarah, who was watching the exchange with careful attention. "We'll continue this conversation," he told her. "I'll be available whenever you need me," Sarah replied, but something in her tone suggested that might not be much longer. Inside the communications bunker, Marcus accepted the encrypted handset and waited for the connection to establish.
When Division's voice came through, the message was brief and unambiguous.
"Rodriguez, you have a civilian contractor named Sarah Chen on your base. Her work is classified at levels above your clearance. You are directed to provide any support she requests and to refrain from operational interference.
This directive comes directly from CENTCOM with endorsement from Washington." Acknowledge.
Marcus felt the pieces of the puzzle shifting into a new configuration. Sarah Chen wasn't just protected by high-level authorizations, she was operating under direct orders from the highest levels of command. Whatever she was doing had the attention and approval of people who made decisions about national security.
Acknowledged, Marcus said, though every instinct rebelled against operating blind in his own area of responsibility.
One more thing, the voice from Division continued.
Recent intelligence suggests significant hostile activity in your sector.
Be prepared for possible contact within the next 72 hours. Your primary mission is base security and force protection. Other operations in your area are compartmentalized. The call ended, leaving Marcus with more questions than answers but a clearer understanding of his position. Sarah Chen was operating under authorities that superseded his command, pursuing objectives he wasn't cleared to know. His job was to keep his people safe while someone else handled the specialized work. Outside the communications bunker, Marcus found Sarah waiting with an expression that suggested she knew exactly what conversation had just taken place.
Clearer picture now, she asked quietly.
Some things, Marcus admitted. Others are still murky. They always are, in this business, Sarah said with what might have been sympathy. The important thing to understand is that everything happening here is carefully coordinated. Your people aren't in danger from friendly operations, but there are definitely hostile elements that need to be dealt with.
The rogue sniper you mentioned? Among other things, Sarah confirmed.
The situation is more complex than a single operator, but individual elimination is part of the solution. Marcus studied her face, seeing new layers of meaning in her earlier conversations. You're not hunting him, he said with sudden understanding.
You're hunting them. Multiple targets. Sarah's smile was grimmer now, touched with something that might have been anticipation.
The pattern analysis identified a network, Colonel. What's been happening in this region isn't the work of one person, but rather a coordinated operation involving multiple skilled operators working for interests that don't align with coalition objectives.
How many? We've identified at least 4 individuals with the capabilities to conduct the precision eliminations we've documented.
They've been operating independently but with coordination that suggests common command and control. Marcus felt the scope of the situation expanding in ways that made his earlier concerns seem almost trivial. A network of professional snipers operating in his area of responsibility represented a threat far beyond normal insurgent activity. What's the timeline for resolution? He asked.
Sarah consulted her watch, a precise chronometer that looked more military than civilian. Active operations begin tonight. The network has been identified and isolated. Final phase should be completed within 72 hours. And you're conducting these operations alone?
I have the capabilities required, Sarah said simply.
And sometimes surgical problems require surgical solutions.
As she walked away, Marcus realized that he'd been fundamentally wrong about Sarah Chen's role at Forward Operating Base Vanguard. She wasn't investigating patterns of sniper activity, she was the solution to them. Whatever network of hostile operators had been terrorizing the region was about to discover that someone with even more specialized skills had been tracking them, studying their methods, and preparing to eliminate them with the kind of precision that made legends. The morning sun climbed higher above the mountain peaks, promising another day of deceptive tranquility in a region where the most deadly games were played by people invisible to normal observation. Marcus returned to his duties knowing that within hours, the operational environment would change dramatically, and the woman he'd shared dinner with would transform from mysterious consultant into something far more dangerous. In her temporary quarters, Sarah began the methodical process of preparing for nighttime operations. Her rifle received a final inspection, ammunition was selected and verified, and equipment was organized with the systematic precision of someone who had conducted similar missions across multiple continents. Tonight would test 15 years of training, experience, and planning against opponents whose skills had made them legendary in their own right. The hunter had become the hunted, but the roles were about to reverse in ways that would leave only one side standing when the mountain dawn revealed the night's work. The sun disappeared behind the western peaks at 1847 hours, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold that reminded Marcus why poets had written about mountain sunsets for centuries. But, tonight, the beauty carried an ominous undertone. Somewhere in the surrounding darkness, deadly forces were preparing to collide in ways that would reshape the operational landscape of the entire region. Sarah had vanished from the base shortly after their morning conversation, leaving behind only a brief note indicating she would be conducting field research for an unspecified duration. Marcus knew better than to send search parties or demand explanations, but the absence of her composed presence made the approaching night feel heavier with possibility. At 2100 hours, the first radio transmission crackled through the base communications system. A patrol in Sector 7 reported movement on the northern ridge line, multiple figures moving with the kind of tactical discipline that suggested professional military training rather than local insurgent activity. "Base, this is Hunter 2-3, came the voice of Staff Sergeant Williams, one of Marcus's most experienced team leaders. "We've got eyes on at least 3 individuals moving in coordinated formation approximately 2 clicks north of our position. They're carrying long weapons and moving like they know what they're doing." Marcus keyed his radio from the Tactical Operations Center, where he'd stationed himself to monitor the night's developments. "Hunter 2-3, can you identify specific equipment or capabilities?" "Negative on specific identification, but their movement profile suggests sniper teams. They're using terrain masking and moving in leapfrog patterns consistent with Overwatch tactics." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. The hostile sniper network Sarah had described was apparently positioning itself for operations, and his patrol was dangerously close to becoming their first target. "Hunter 2-3, fall back to Overwatch position Delta and maintain observation only. Do not engage unless directly threatened." "Roger that, base. Moving to Delta now." For 30 minutes, the radio traffic consisted of routine position reports and negative contact updates. Marcus began to wonder if the night would pass without the dramatic confrontation Sarah's warnings had suggested. Then, at 2143 hours, everything changed. The sound came first, a distant crack that echoed off the mountain walls like thunder, followed 3 seconds later by a second shot from a different direction. Marcus's radio erupted with urgent transmissions as multiple patrols reported muzzle flashes and the distinctive supersonic snap of high-velocity rounds passing overhead. "Base, Hunter 2-3. We've got sniper fire from multiple positions. Someone's engaging the targets we identified earlier. Hunter 4-1 reporting muzzle flashes on the eastern slope. Long-range engagement in progress." Marcus grabbed his radio and began coordinating responses while trying to piece together what was happening in the darkness beyond his perimeter. The pattern of fire suggested multiple shooters engaging each other from extended ranges, exactly the kind of professional duel Sarah had been preparing for. Over the next hour, the firefight developed into something Marcus had never experienced in 23 years of military service. Instead of the chaotic, close-range combat typical of counterinsurgency operations, this was a methodical long-distance engagement between individuals who possessed skills that bordered on supernatural. The radio reports painted a picture of precision warfare being conducted at ranges that pushed the limits of human capability. Muzzle flashes appeared on distant peaks, followed by impacts that suggested accuracy levels most soldiers could only dream of achieving. Between the shots, there were long periods of silence as each shooter repositioned, calculated new firing solutions, and searched for opportunities to gain advantage over equally skilled opponents. "Base, this is Hunter 2-3. We just observed what appeared to be a confirmed kill at approximately 1500 meters. Single shot, target went down and stayed down. Hunter 4-1 here. Movement on the northern approach has ceased. Looks like someone eliminated the team that was setting up there." Marcus realized he was listening to the systematic destruction of the sniper network that had been terrorizing the region. One by one, Sarah was eliminating opponents who possessed skills nearly equal to her own, using the darkness and her intimate knowledge of their operational patterns to gain the tactical advantage needed for success. At 0147 hours, the radio traffic suddenly intensified as multiple patrols reported a running firefight moving through the valley system east of the base. This wasn't the methodical long-range engagement that had characterized the earlier action. This was close-quarters combat between individuals who had closed to ranges where every shot could be decisive. "Base, Hunter 7-2. We've got movement on the eastern perimeter. Someone's moving fast in our direction." Marcus grabbed his gear and headed for the eastern observation post, arriving just as a figure emerged from the darkness beyond the concertina wire. Even in the green glow of night vision equipment, he recognized Sarah's distinctive silhouette immediately. She was moving with the controlled urgency of someone who had completed a mission but wasn't yet clear of danger. Her rifle was slung across her back, and she carried what appeared to be additional equipment that hadn't been part of her original loadout. "Open the gate," Marcus ordered, and the perimeter guards complied immediately. Sarah passed through the defensive perimeter with visible relief, but Marcus could see the cost of the night's work in her posture and movement. She was favoring her left side slightly, and there was a tear in her camouflage jacket that suggested a very close call.
"Mission accomplished?" Marcus asked as she approached the observation post.
"Network neutralized," Sarah confirmed, her voice carrying the flat exhaustion that followed intense combat.
"4 targets eliminated, operational infrastructure disrupted.
The threat to coalition forces in this sector has been removed." Marcus studied her face in the observation post's dim red lighting, seeing something he hadn't expected. Instead of the satisfaction of a job well done, Sarah looked haunted in a way that suggested the night's work had carried personal costs beyond physical exhaustion. "Were they who you expected?" he asked. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the mountains where the firefight had taken place.
"Yes and no," she said finally.
"The network was exactly what we thought it was, former military specialists working for private interests. But the personal dynamics were more complicated than intelligence had suggested."
"Complicated how?" "I knew 2 of them," Sarah said quietly. "Trained with them, worked alongside them in previous deployments.
Whatever they became involved in here, they weren't the same people I remembered." Marcus began to understand the weight Sarah had been carrying. She hadn't just been hunting anonymous enemies, she'd been tracking down former colleagues who had crossed lines that put them beyond redemption. "That must have been difficult," Marcus said with genuine sympathy. "Necessary," Sarah replied, but her tone suggested she was trying to convince herself as much as him. "Sometimes the hardest decisions are the most important ones." They were interrupted by Marcus's communications sergeant, who arrived at the observation post with an urgent message.
"Colonel, we're getting reports from multiple sectors.
Whatever happened tonight, it's had effects beyond our immediate area. 3 different forward operating bases are reporting that sniper activity that's been plaguing them for months just went silent." Marcus nodded, understanding that Sarah's mission had been far larger in scope than he'd realized. The network she'd eliminated had apparently been operating across multiple sectors, conducting a coordinated campaign of precision strikes that had been affecting coalition operations throughout the region.
"Any word from higher command?" Marcus asked.
"Yes, sir. Division sends their compliments and asks that you relay their appreciation to our civilian consultant for exceptional professional performance." Sarah smiled for the first time since returning to the base, but it was a tired expression touched with sadness.
"Tell them the job is finished," she said.
"The pattern analysis is complete, and the identified threats have been resolved." As the communications sergeant headed back to relay the message, Marcus and Sarah stood in companionable silence watching the eastern sky begin to lighten with approaching dawn. The mountains looked peaceful in the growing light, giving no hint of the deadly drama that had played out in their shadows.
"What happens now?" Marcus asked. "Now I go back to being a boring academic consultant," Sarah said with what might have been relief. "The exciting part of this assignment is over." "Will you be staying on the base?" Sarah shook her head. "I'll be leaving this afternoon. There are reports to file, debriefings to attend, and other patterns to analyze in other places."
Marcus realized he would miss her presence, despite the complications she'd brought to his orderly military world.
"If you're ever in the area again."
"I'll look you up," Sarah promised, though they both knew that people in her line of work rarely returned to the same operational areas twice. As the morning progressed and the base returned to its normal rhythm of activity, Sarah Chen prepared to disappear as mysteriously as she had arrived. Her rifle was cleaned and packed away, her gear organized with the same methodical precision Marcus had observed from their first encounter. At 1,400 hours, a helicopter arrived to extract her, along with several pieces of equipment that Marcus didn't recognize and wasn't cleared to ask about.
As Sarah walked toward the landing zone, she turned back to give him a final wave.
"Thank you for the hospitality, Colonel," she called over the rotor noise. "And, remember, sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who smile and share dinner while planning precision solutions to complex problems." With that cryptic farewell, Sarah Chen climbed aboard the helicopter and disappeared into the Afghan sky, leaving behind only questions and the knowledge that legends sometimes walked among ordinary mortals for brief, extraordinary moments. Marcus stood watching until the aircraft vanished behind the mountain peaks, then returned to his duties knowing that forward operating base Vanguard was a safer place because of a woman whose true name he would probably never know and whose full capabilities he could only imagine. In the weeks that followed, reports filtering in from across the theater confirmed that sniper activity throughout the region had dropped to practically nothing. The precision elimination campaign that had been terrorizing coalition forces for months had ended as suddenly and mysteriously as it had begun. Years later, when Marcus had retired and was writing his memoirs, he would struggle to find words for the 3 days when a ghost named Sarah Chen had materialized at his base, eliminated a network of professional killers with surgical precision, and vanished back into the shadows from which she'd come. Some stories, he realized, were too extraordinary for ordinary words, and some heroes operated in places where recognition would only compromise their ability to continue protecting others. The modified M24 rifle that had started their acquaintance remained a mystery whose secrets had disappeared with its owner, but Marcus never forgot the lesson it represented, that in a world of complex threats, the most effective responses often came from people who understood precision not just as a technical skill, but as a way of life that demanded absolute commitment to protecting what mattered most. Somewhere in the world, he knew, Sarah Chen continued her work, analyzing patterns and eliminating threats with the same methodical competence she'd brought to the mountains of Afghanistan. And, somewhere, other soldiers were a little safer because a legend had walked among them for 3 days and nights, asked simple questions, and provided answers written in steel and gunpowder against the canvas of an endless war.